The story of mission outreach at Second Presbyterian Church begins with our being a mission outreach. With Roanoke Presbyterian Church's blessing, some of its members became charter members of a new Southwest neighborhood church. The new congregation could not sustain itself at first and needed a loan from Penn Mutual Life and continuing subsidy from its parent church. But still, the new congregation needing help found ways to offer help to others. Every month, it would take up a special offering to contribute to a cause suggested by the General Assembly. How about that? I thought that we came up with something new with our monthly outreach offering. However, I will say this. The monthly offering back then was different in nature than the monthly offering today. Most of the recipients back then were evangelism projects, efforts to bring people to Christ and to grow churches, like Bible distribution, building new congregations, and spreading the gospel overseas. A striking indication that this was a different day is that one of the evangelistic efforts was for the sake of the colored population. It didn't take long, though, for the church's outreach efforts to begin to shift from evangelism to meeting human needs, shifting from a paternalistic approach to mission partnerships. The story of outreach at Second Presbyterian Church is in great part a story of those shifts. Let's go back to the earliest years. An honest assessment of the church under its first two pastors, R.C. Anderson and James Arthur, would be this: the church was focused on its own growth and health. It had to be that way. The church needed to gain strength before it could turn its focus to the needs of the world. It was under Dr. Arthur Robotham that the church began to become the mission-minded congregation that it is today. When Dr. Arthur Robotham arrived on the scene, there were no benevolences in the budget. Now, that's not to say that there was no outreach. There was because of those monthly offerings, and even more because of the women of the church. This was a day when most women in the church did not work outside the home. They also were not allowed to serve on the session as elders. But strong, capable, and faithful women with leadership skills and a passion to serve cannot be held back. The women formed auxiliary societies. That's what they were called. They were devoted to serving members needing help that were within the congregation, but also addressing needs in the community and beyond. Examples are the Foreign Mission Society, the Home Mission Society, and the Ladies' Aid Society. As the men on the session made decisions and conducted business, these societies and the women that were in them did most of the church's work of compassion. There was one man, however, who was equally committed to outreach and brought mission into the heart of the session's work, even if it came because the session thought that he needed oversight. That man was Dr. Robotham. He served as the church's minister, but also served as the church's de facto missionary. He conducted Sunday evening services for blue-collar employees of the Norfolk and Western shops who had to work Sunday mornings, and for jail inmates. Also, as Reverend Brandon pointed out during his video about the church during the Great World Wars, Robotham took a 2-year leave of absence to serve as a chaplain during the First World War. Then, upon his resignation from Second Presbyterian, he became the superintendent for home missions for Montgomery Presbytery and was given substantial salary support from Second Presbyterian, $2,000 a year. But let's back up and talk about how Robotham brought mission into the heart of the session's work. He kind of got ahead of himself. He established a fund so as to support a missionary to China named Annie R.V. Wilson. Tracking the finances of the fund became a huge headache as the fiscal year of the fund did not match up with the fiscal year of the church. And friction developed between the session and Robotham over when and how much money was to be sent. The session came very close to dropping Wilson as a missionary, and possibly reminding the minister to focus on his primary duties of preaching, teaching, and pastoral care, and leave the financial work of the church to those who know better. But that is not what happened, and a new direction of the church was set. In 1911, the session decided to put missionary support as well as other benevolent causes in the church budget. Now, I don't understand why, but for some reason, the session had to justify this action to the General Assembly, and they did so by expressing the hope that this new strategy would double the amount of money given to outreach. It did not play out that way. It actually tripled the money given to outreach. Robotham has been remembered as the preacher with the Scottish lilt. I now think that's a bit unfair. I think it's more fair to say that it was under Dr. Robotham that the church came into maturity and found its identity. Robotham, who was so invested in building the stone sanctuary that we now worship in, that he went to the quarry and helped pick out stones, was also the pastor who, through leadership and example, led the church to become a congregation that it is today, a congregation with a servant's heart. Commitment to missions deepened when Dr. Edmonds arrived. Shortly after his arrival, the church took on the support of 2 additional missionaries, one to Korea and one to Brazil. And then came the Great Depression. Church income was cut in half, and budgeted benevolences were halved as well. Yet human suffering increased. The church went back to the strategy of special monthly offerings, but this time not for evangelism, but for needs like feeding hungry bellies and providing shelter for the suddenly homeless. The offerings went to members in the church who were in need, as well as to people in desperation in the community and in the larger world. There is one major outreach of Second Presbyterian Church that began in the last 2 years of Robotham's ministry, but became a major outreach during Dr. Edmonds' years. In 1917, church members Walter and Margaret Michael brought a brand new bike for Johnny, their youngest son, so he could take a job running deliveries. The bike was brought home and quickly stolen. Walter and Margaret were furious, and they were convinced that someone who lived in the neighborhood in the flood zone by the river had taken it. This is where Reserve Avenue dead ends into Franklin Road, the place where the Ramada Inn was recently demolished. Walter and Margaret went door to door in that neighborhood looking for the bike that they never found. What they found instead was desperate poverty. Their anger gave way to compassion. Margaret got into a conversation with Mrs. Smith, who lived there, and asked where she and her family went to church. Mrs. Smith answered, "We don't have nice enough clothes to go to those nice churches in Southwest, so we just don't go." The Michaels felt they had to do something. With Second's support, they joined with Mrs. Smith in organizing a Sunday school class for children of the neighborhood that would meet in Mrs. Smith's home. The effort grew to involve adults of the neighborhood and became known as the Franklin Road Mission. What you really need to understand about this mission is that it was not a paternalistic effort to help people there. It was a partnership with the people who lived there. A faith community grew with its own leadership and with an identity that suited the people of the neighborhood. For this reason, the church that developed eventually was not Presbyterian. It was and is non-denominational. Eventually, Second Presbyterian bought a piece of property in the area that they then leased to the mission for $1 a year. And on that spot, members of the mission community built a church on their own, working after they got home from their jobs on weekdays and working on weekends. Eventually, Second Presbyterian deeded the property to the congregation for a cost of $1,500, and the Franklin Road Mission became an independent congregation. Its name was changed to Calvary Memorial Church. The congregation never forgot Second's role. Until her death, they invited the Michaels' daughter, Betty Culpepper, to all their special events,
And a word of thanks to Second Presbyterian can be found today on their website.
In 1924, the year after Dr. Edmonds arrived, something else happened that was to be a sign of things to come. A sizable bequest of $3,000 was received from the estate of Edmund T. Burnett, and a fund was established for benevolent causes. Income from the fund was to go to an orphanage, the Presbyterian Home Mission, and for aged ministers. I bet the members of the church then would be amazed at how much the restricted funds of the church now help with outreach causes, like sending youth on mission trips, addressing mental health issues, nurturing newly ordained ministers, offering a lecture series to the community, and supporting programs and ministries that address poverty and children at risk. On the whole, Dr. Edmonds addressed political and social issues in his teaching and civic involvement. He set a record among Second's ministers for the number of organizations that he joined. He rarely addressed social and political issues from the pulpit. It is interesting to see what stands he did take from the pulpit. He publicly stood against showing movies on Sundays. And as the Nazis were sweeping across Europe, he supported isolationism. As is so often the case, what seems to be of such central importance today ends up seeming minor or misguided in another day. The glory of the leadership of Dr. Edmonds and the session he served with was their sustained and continued focus on the historic role of the church to nurture its members and offer compassion in the world. In terms of nurturing its members, Edmonds averaged over 600 home visits a year. He kept track. That is amazing. In terms of addressing issues in the world, the church preached with its actions. It remained an outreach-minded congregation that prioritized addressing human needs over talking about them. That priority remains at Second, even in a highly polarized time when sides are encouraged to be taken for the sake of ideological battles to be won. Our church continues to make its primary witness through effective engagement with others in addressing real-world needs in a way that can make a difference. In 1942, Dr. Hollingsworth arrived. He inherited a dynamic ministry partner in Mary Bingham, and many of his ministerial successes were hers as well. Dr. Hollingsworth's honeymoon with the church was somewhat muted by the financial constraints of the Second World War. But when the war ended, the church's ministry expanded, as did its outreach. Growth of the congregation took place despite the hard times that came upon the southwest neighborhood. Members of the church migrated, most to the suburb of South Roanoke, though some out to the new Smith Mountain Lake. The neighborhood surrounding the church became increasingly unstable. When a neighborhood declines, the temptation of a church within it is to move to a more stable neighborhood and near to the homes of existing and potential members. Perhaps the most significant development of the church's outreach during these years was the default decision to stay where the church was planted. And not only that, not only staying where it was planted, but actually expanding its programs and facilities. It is hard to convey how significant it is that the church remain planted in place, that we are today seen as serving the entire city and region, that we're a leading contributor of funds and volunteers to significant Roanoke ministries and services that address the city's major needs, that we're a church that doesn't just exist for its members, but for the world, is in large part due to the decision to stay. Yes, most members now drive past other Presbyterian churches to get to Second. And of course, they make the drive because of what the church can offer them in terms of worship, education, and fellowship. But many also make the drive because of what the church does for others. During Dr. Holly's tenure, the church's preschool was begun. Now, you may not think of the preschool as outreach, but this one was. As the only official preschool program in Roanoke, ours met a pressing need. And then, as other church preschools opened up, ours did what others did not. Ours accepted Jewish children. The most significant outreach of the church during Dr. Holly's years came in 1977 at the end of his tenure with the establishment of the Presbyterian Community Center. The PCC was established because Montgomery Presbytery identified Roanoke's southeast neighborhood as being in crisis. The crisis came of the close of the viscose plant as well as cutbacks at Norfolk and Southern. The Presbytery brought first Reverend Ted Edlick and then Reverend Ben Sparks to serve as a minister to the inner city. And each had an office in a house owned by the church that stood on what is today's Mountain Avenue parking area. Dr. Holly served as a mentor to these fresh out of seminary directors. The church supported the PCC for another reason. The center would be a way to consolidate the efforts of churches, particularly downtown churches, in responding to appeals for food, assistance, and help with rent and utility bills. Consolidation would increase efficiency while reducing scams. As the PCC grew, it recognized that for the transformation of lives and neighborhoods to take place, efforts have to go past meeting immediate needs to addressing systemic issues. So programs like the Pathways After School program were started. Today, the PCC is looking to finish a $6 million campaign to build a building that will now adequately house the programs that it has and replace a facility that's expensive to maintain. That Second Presbyterian stay planted in the southwest neighborhood is a big reason why Dr. William R. Klein accepted the call to be the church's next senior minister. During the Klein years, the church added some notable outreach efforts, such as becoming a major partner with Habitat for Humanity, offering an after-school program for girls at the Highland Park School, offering a Bible school for the West End neighborhood, and establishing a pastoral counseling center headed by Dr. Leo Howard. We have traditions today that began during Dr. Klein's years. The tradition of annual mission trips began when an associate pastor, Reverend Frank Mays, took youth to work camps in West Virginia. Second, our strong outreach to newly ordained ministers began with Dr. Klein. For 8 years, our church would host an intern in Union Presbyterian Seminary's Doctor of Ministry program. Dr. Klein served not only as that intern supervisor, but also served as a theological mentor for other interns in the area. Once a month, they would come to Roanoke, and he would meet with them for 2 days. And third, Second Presbyterian became a church known for producing more than its fair share of candidates for ministry. Dr. Wilfred Hobby, my favorite professor at seminary, was one of them. Another was Jean Edmonds, the daughter-in-law of Dr. Spencer Edmonds. Endorsed by our session, Jean went to Columbia Theological Seminary. Eventually, she moved back to Roanoke, first to serve as associate pastor at Raleigh Court Presbyterian Church, and then to serve as a jail chaplain. Jean took the time to get to know the prisoners as people, and they responded to her personal interests, lack of judgmentalism, and abundant grace. Over the years, many asked to be baptized, and Jean got their baptisms approved by our church session. Now, to the years that I have served at Second Presbyterian. But before I talk about outreach stories during my tenure, I need to say something that was also true of the other senior ministers who served before me. The pastors and other staff that I have served with are a big part of the story. It is important to point out that it's usually been someone else on staff who has served as liaison to the Service and Outreach Committee. And the chairs of those committees and its members, as well as others in the church who have given of themselves, have made possible what we have accomplished the last 25 years. Now let's go back to the tradition of nurturing newly ordained ministers. For years, I had daydreamed about creating a continuing education program for new ministers that would reflect what I was so lucky to have received, but which I saw so many others being denied. I would often talk about this dream with my good friend, Dr. Ed McLeod, who shared it. Then, a bequest came to the church from John Trent for the purpose of religious education that made it possible for this dream to become a reality. Working with Ed and Dr. Ken McFadden at Union Presbyterian Seminary, we established in 2008 the Kitty Susan Trent Symposium for Newly Ordained Ministers. Every year, through a nomination and application process, 8 promising new ministers are chosen to come to Roanoke for 6 days and then go through these seminars which focused on areas that are hard to teach in seminary. Things like staffing and finance, fundraising, strategic planning, conflict. Most of the seminars are taught by experienced pastors or by lay people with real-world experience and wisdom to offer. Over 100 ministers have gone through the program, with almost all of them still in ordained ministry. We are lead supporters of Union Presbyterian Seminary and the Montreat and Massanetta Conference Centers, but this symposium that trains church leaders clearly is the most powerful way we now impact the larger church. Another major outreach of this congregation came of something that I noticed when I came here to serve as a pastor. This congregation has an enormous number of people who work in medicine and construction. How could I not notice? The session agreed that we needed to find a mission outreach that would put these gifts to gospel use. But we needed a mission partner to help us. Using Dr. John Mann, Becky Battle, and Catherine Booth as our scouts, we eventually found the organization that is now called Solid Rock International. Solid Rock partners with a Dominican group in focusing its efforts on San Juan de la Maguana in the Dominican Republic. It uses mission teams from the states to build and support schools, to offer Bible schools, and to offer medical care, including surgery. Though it was then a Mennonite organization, many of the churches involved were and are Presbyterian. Through 2 decades of our involvement, we have sent over 400 people on mission teams, many going repeatedly. One early team member was a missionary that we sponsored, Romero Ross. For most of the year, he worked with Florida migrant workers and their families, but for 1 week out of the year, he was one of our translators and chaplains. Now is the time to make a very important point. We don't do mission tourism. Because we return to the same place over and over again, we have become genuine partners with Dominicans in offering a distinctively Dominican ministry. We have developed strong and lasting relationships, and we've contributed to substantial positive change. Another significant outreach we got involved with within the first few years of my arrival was Interfaith Hospitality, now called Family Promise. This is a program that partners with families to move from housing insecurity to housing stability. A week at a time, faith communities would open up their facilities and provide the hospitality of meals and companionship. Over time, increasingly strict zoning regulations led to fewer and fewer facilities being made available for this project. Second Presbyterian made its Alpha Omega House, now Alexa House, available to other faith communities in response. Only Alexa House needed a major renovation for it to continue to meet increasingly strict code requirements. Mentioning the renovation of Alexa House brings me to the latest major mission project of this church. I hope you have picked up that part of the story of outreach at Second is developing mission partnerships. Well, around 2018, 4 partners of long standing approached the church at the same time, each asking for help with a major capital project to expand their work and witness. One was Union Presbyterian Seminary, which wanted to renovate a dorm to serve as a leadership institute and name a center within the institute after Dr. Klein. A second was Solid Rock International, which needed help to finish raising funds to complete the building of a hospital to replace a clinic that sits in the floodplain. The other 2 were local. The PCC needed a new facility to house its expanding ministry. And we needed to renovate Alexa House, not only for Family Promise, but also for a remote prison visitation program, a ministry of visitation of inmates. We felt called to help with all 4 projects, but the only way we could do so was through a special campaign. So the church launched its Mission Build campaign to raise $1.7 million to be split almost evenly between the 4 projects. The Mission Build campaign was started, but it barely began when the pandemic hit. With the uncertainty of the pandemic and in-person visits out of the question, we put the campaign on hold. A year went by, and still most people did not want to meet in person. But the church decided that the needs were not going to go away. Building costs were only increasing, and we needed to do what we could do even if we could not raise the full amount. So we resumed the campaign and conducted most of the visits by phone, which is not the ideal way to raise money. Remarkably, the campaign not only reached its goal, but exceeded it. I'm reminded of how the church successfully conducted a building campaign right after the 2008 financial crisis. But anyway, by the time that all 4 projects of the Mission Build campaign are dedicated, our church will have raised over $2 million. Sunday, August 28th, was a significant day of worship in our church's history when we celebrated the successful meeting of the campaign's goal with representatives of all 4 mission partners coming to church and helping with worship. I have left out many exciting outreach projects out, such as when our church raised $180,000 and sent multiple teams to the Gulf Coast to help after Hurricane Katrina. I could also tell about Ken and Stacy Potter moving to San Juan, Ken for 3 years, so that he could help oversee the construction of the hospital, which was dedicated on March 28, 2023. I just don't have time to talk about all of them. I need to conclude this video, and I'll do so with a few observations. My first reflection. Often churches that spend money on its own programming and facilities are criticized for spending money on themselves when they could be helping others. That criticism is justified with many churches and in many places, but it is often the case that churches that offer the strongest outreach are churches that take care of their own members and facilities. Go back and remember the tenure of Dr. Arthur Robotham. During his years, the church first built the stone sanctuary we worship in, but it also took a major turn toward becoming a mission-minded church. Or remember recent history. The church that spent millions on construction and renovation raised millions for the Mission Build campaign. I hope Second Presbyterian remembers what many churches forget. The church that does not take care of itself usually ends up not doing a good job taking care of others. I will say our building campaign was off budget, and we're raising a fund to increasingly take facility maintenance off the church budget, so more of pledged dollars will go to help with programming and outreach. My second reflection. Often the goal of outreach is get to the point where the outreach is not needed. Second Presbyterian began as a mission project, but then became a self-sustaining congregation helping others. The Franklin Road Mission became a self-sustaining congregation. Family Promise and Habitat for Humanity help families gain housing independence. Our efforts that have to do with education are so that children in at-risk communities can gain skills to lead stable lives. I anticipate the day will come when we'll no longer be needed in San Juan de la Maguana, for the schools and hospital we helped build will be able to stand on their own. It is the heart of Christ and the heart of this church to help those who cannot help themselves. But it's also the heart of Christ and of this church to stand beside and partner with those who want to stand and walk on their own. My third reflection. The systemic issues that plague Roanoke and elsewhere have to do with poverty, mental illness, healthcare, education, homelessness, and abuse. And these often reflect cultural privileging of race, gender, and class. For the church to follow Jesus, it must lean as he leans, and that is toward those whose needs are often overlooked, whose voices are often unheard, and who have had barriers placed in their lives that others do not have to overcome. Social issues are important because they are human issues. But it's easy to voice opinions and take stands on them because everyone has an opinion. The real question of outreach, though, is what effective difference can we make? Second Presbyterian Church has done something really difficult to do. It has gotten to the place where even with members who disagree about issues can actually do something substantial about them. Tutor students and help the Highland Park School reach accreditation, help turn the Southwest and Southeast communities around, change the trajectory of potentially homeless mothers with children, bless other churches through the nurture of the ministers that serve them, provide artificial limbs, perform surgeries, and build a hospital that will forever change the city it sits in. That we have the opportunity to bear witness to the love and grace of God in these ways is a hard-to-reach privilege and responsibility. It came because of a generational commitment of this congregation that persevered through wars, a depression, and a pandemic. When the temptation was to think only of institutional survival, this church asked what it could do to help. These Kairos videos have asked you to consider what would have happened if this church had never existed. Where would important ministries like the PCC and Family Promise be if we had not been around? Calvary Memorial Church and the Trent Symposium simply would not exist. Would there be a hospital in San Juan about to be dedicated? And what would have happened to those youth and adults who found themselves when they were given the opportunity to serve others? I could go on and on. As the congregation remains strong, as its members remain committed to give of their time, and as restricted funds grow, we will be able to do more amazing things in the name of the one whose life was a particular and personal outreach of God to us, if we remember to be committed to each other so that we can bear a strong witness to the world. Let's pray and work to keep going this story of how the grace of God in Christ is proclaimed in ways that make a real difference in the world.